Jill Borland and Rosemary Slater to talk about their presentation, Designing Online Training That Works for Parents, a Regional Approach. I apologise to everyone for the technical hitches. Let's hope that Jill has a slightly easier ride with sharing her slides. Jill, over to you, please.
How is that? Can people see it?
Yes, I can see that.
Hooray. Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to College for your kind invitation to speak today. My name is Jill Borland, and I'm a speech and language therapist working in the Western Health and Social Care Trust in Northern Ireland.
And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rosie Slater, Paediatric Service Lead in the Northern Health and Social Care Trust in Northern Ireland. And for the next few minutes, Jill and I are going to take you through a recent service improvement initiative undertaken by the Northern Ireland Regional Paediatric Digital Group.
Okay, so firstly, it may be helpful to briefly set the scene about the local context and the work of the Regional Paediatric Digital Group. In Northern Ireland, there are 5 health trusts. These are responsible for both health and social care. SLTs working in these health and social care trusts are all employed by the health service. You can see on the map the areas covered by each trust and imagine the variability in terms of a very urban, population-dense area like Belfast Trust, as compared with Western, which is a mix of both rural and urban populations. Incidentally, both Western and Belfast Trust serve a population of around 300,000 people. There is considerable regional working in an effort to provide equitable access to services across the province. And in this spirit, the Regional SLT Paediatric Digital Group was formed in March 2018, with a representative from each trust. Its aim was originally to promote and develop the therapeutic use of iPads and apps in paediatric SLT services. Since that time, and particularly with the advent of the COVID pandemic, the role of the group has expanded to cover all areas of telehealth and digital working as related to therapeutic practice. This has included sharing information and good practice around all areas of digital working, helping SLTs get to grips with digital solutions such as boom cards, Simplify and green screens, in addition to our existing roles with apps and iPads. Also using a variety of communications to engage with therapists in clinical practice to raise awareness and understanding of telehealth. This has included a quarterly newsletter, a series of short videos called Tech Tuesdays, and an interactive lunchtime webinar. As we emerged into the post-COVID world and a time of recovery, it became clear that digital solutions had the potential to play a much larger role than previously in all areas of working life. As a group, we noted certain areas of commonality across all trusts. One of these was that all SLT services were offering parent training online, which would previously have only been offered on a face-to-face basis. Anecdotal reports were that this made the training more accessible and convenient for working parents. However, we recognised the need to integrate PPI on a regional basis, thereby enabling service users to help us future plan.
So to this end, we created a short survey on Microsoft Teams. We will go over the detail of this in a second, but if you would like to access it for yourselves, you can scan the QR code on screen using the camera function of your smartphone or tablet. And Jill will be keeping an eye on the chat box if anyone has difficulty accessing the survey, and will add the web link also in case you don't have a second device available to hand. The survey focused on parent and caregiver preferences when accessing online training. The questionnaire had 14 first-person statements for respondents to agree or disagree with. It was quick to complete and was made available to all paediatric SLTs in Northern Ireland to share with their clients and families across specialisms. The questionnaire was shared via paper copies, as well as the hyperlink and QR code on screen. We used the Seesaw app where available in special schools and speech and language units. We also asked people to complete the survey during their clinic appointment using trust iPads in health centres. As you can see, the themes of the questionnaire covered access to Wi-Fi, devices, preferences about presentation style, and opinions around online training. We were aware of the limitations of the survey, and looking back, it may have been beneficial to have involved parents in the design and had a plain English reading group to give their views. We did share a draft version with parents informally to ask for feedback, but this was on quite a small scale. In terms of circulation, we used our already established email networks to share with therapists in individual trusts, as well as other regional groups, for example, our Children with Disability SLT group and a regional community and education SLT group. We also publicised it in the group's quarterly newsletter. The survey was initially planned to have a 2-week response time, but we extended that by another week when it became clear that there hadn't been an even spread across trusts. And using MS Forms meant we could monitor this live and respond accordingly to increase participation and a more even spread of responses. There were some difficulties with distribution of the questionnaire. For example, staff being on leave during the survey period, emails not reaching the intended recipients, and we were also competing for therapist time with several other surveys being circulated around the same time. Despite these challenges, we were delighted to have 318 responses from service users.
So, what did we find out? We have summarised the findings of the survey across the next few slides. As you can see, the vast majority of families had the ability to access the training. However, we felt it was important to realise that this didn't include everyone, and that we could research local alternatives such as libraries, schools and Sure Start services which might provide support. Online video calling has become common practice in many people's working lives, but for those who haven't come across it, it was again important to offer advice and support. Many services had drawn up guides to using Zoom when virtual therapy sessions were the main avenue for therapy, and it was felt that these could be easily updated and shared. We asked families if they prefer to join a live training event, which would usually be more interactive than a pre-recorded session. There was quite a split in terms of preference. This highlighted one of the advantages of online training sessions in that it lends itself to providing a wider range of options to increase accessibility. The next section is around participation during training sessions. Just like face-to-face training, there was variability in terms of people wanting to observe only and those who would be more keen to take part in discussions and even have their cameras on. It may mean participants are more open to attending training if they know they have the option to keep their cameras off, although there would be some training such as Makaton where this obviously isn't an option. The final set of results are around the concept of online training in general. We deliberately didn't ask if families prefer face-to-face versus online training, as we felt we may not be in a position to always offer face-to-face training as an option, particularly in more rural communities. It is striking, however, that only around half of respondents felt online training would be effective. We're not sure what, if any, forms of training these respondents have accessed in the past, and it may be useful to probe if this is a belief around training in general, and whether a percentage of parents prefer SLT intervention provided primarily through one-to-one support.
The results we've just discussed were summarised onto a one-page PDF and circulated to all paediatric SLTs in Northern Ireland. The website we used was Canva, which we also use for the group's newsletters, as we find it an attractive and engaging way to present information, and it's not blocked by any of our trust IT systems. We have encouraged any paediatric therapists who have used the information when planning training to inform us, and have had a few encouraging messages where training has been designed with these preferences in mind. So a quick summary of our main learning from the survey.
Firstly, access to suitable technology is not universal. 1 in 10 respondents did not have access to sufficient Wi-Fi, and 1 in 5 were unable to access an appropriate device to allow them to join an online training session. As always, consider the main purpose of the training being provided. As with any training we provide, clinicians should consider what their desired outcome is before moving on to what the appropriate format may be. Flexibility with rules during training. A certain office-based etiquette has developed during professional video calls. It is worth considering that not everyone has this experience, and SLTs have a role in making our clients comfortable and allaying anxieties which may pose a barrier. Online versus face-to-face. One of the more surprising findings of the survey was that 47% of respondents did not feel that online training would be effective for their child. At this point, we do not know why parents responded in this way. However, as online training delivery has now been integrated into our service delivery model, it will be important to investigate this further as part of our ongoing support to families. So to finish, by returning to the Regional Paediatric Digital Group, we will continue to provide a quarterly newsletter with updates as well as app and website recommendations. We seek to continue sharing good practice and promoting the use of digital technology in therapy. Our next piece of work will be around producing a frequently updated library of apps and digital resources which will be made available to SLTs working in Northern Ireland. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Lovely. If I could ask, next we have Sarah Fincham Majumdar from the University of Reading. Sarah, have you got your presentation ready to share?
Yes, I think so. Let's just see. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, yeah.
So we didn't practice beforehand. Is it I'm on the page that says toggle, and it says choose share with the app, and I think we were advised to go for Windows. Is that right?
Yeah. I'll ask you to screen share, so hopefully that will.
Share now. I'm not sure if you can see. Can you see notes page as well?
We can see the notes page. If you're on Windows, you could do slide. I think set up slideshow and do it within one window and then restart it. So browse individual, browse individual and then restart it.
So literally close it down.
No, just from beginning. See if you can do from beginning again and reshare.
Okay, and then go window again.
Let me stop sharing and then ask you to reshare, and hopefully we'll give it another go.
Does that look like
if you could start, have you clicked from beginning on the left under file?
I have now.
Yep. There we go. Can you progress it on?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Does that work for you?
Yes, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. You go ahead.
Okay, sorry if I'm looking slightly up at my screen. I've got a few notes that I'm trying to on a different screen.
Absolutely fine. We're looking forward to it. You go ahead.
Okay, so hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a speech and language therapist and clinical lecturer and PhD student at the University of Reading. Tom, Lucas and Emma Pagnamenta are my fabulous PhD supervisors. Really excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about my one phase of PhD work. So let me get started. So what led to this project? So let me just see if I can, that's not going, wrong mouse, there we are. Can you see that? Yeah, you can see, can I just check that you can see that? I think you probably can. Okay, so what led to this project? So I do know that families can't be summed up on paper. But bear with me, as I'm sure you can probably relate to this experience. So I've been asking myself why, on paper, two families can present in a fairly similar way, and we can perhaps provide them with fairly similar evidence or the same evidence-based support. And the families are engaging in a way that tells us that the support being offered is perhaps being useful for them. Yet we know that the response to the support is often quite variable. And as you can see from the arrows, outcome data also confirms this. So what's contributing to this difference? Okay, so background. So let me give you a little bit of information here about preschool autistic children's needs. So as I'm sure many of you will be aware, 30% of autistic individuals remain minimally verbal. So parents and carers of preschool autistic children who are seeking support around communication needs have the right to know whether the support that they're going to be seeking for their child is going to benefit them. I've written a point here about support over intervention, because within our own clinical practice at University of Reading at the moment, we're starting to use the word support in place of intervention in line with preferences of the autistic community. On the basis that support implies that individuals are given tools and environments to flourish in, whereas intervention would imply that intervention or treatment implies that individuals are expected to change. Please accept my apologies if I'm using these changes interchangeably, but I think it's a fairly new shift for us. But I will be making references to existing literature, which still obviously uses intervention. Okay, so as you'll be aware, support needs for individuals, autistic individuals, is highly variable, and this is in part because of it being a highly heterogeneous group. So we're quite lucky in the field of autism that there are nice guidelines, and nice guidelines tell us that parents and educators working with preschool autistic children should be trained by specialists to help develop social communication, and that these can be by specialists, and this can be conducted through things like video feedback. So I'm going to be talking here a little bit about parent-mediated intervention, and that's a vast area, but specifically thinking about teams like PACT and JASPER who have led the way in this area. So we know that communication support has been identified as research priorities by the James Lind Alliance. So this is autistic individuals and autistic allies, identifying that both parent education and better understanding about what interventions are working are important. And this particular piece of work also kind of speaks to the call about who intervention works best for. So what is already known? What is already known about PMI? So there's lots of research that's been conducted into outcomes, as you'll probably be aware, but just as a really quick summary and kind of some of the bigger studies that have been done. So Uno and colleagues conducted a Cochrane review, systematic review, that showed that parent-mediated intervention for young autistic children led to changes in parent-child interaction as expected, because that's the target of the intervention or the support. And across studies, it was also noticed that receptive language skills were improving, which is further from the target of intervention, but it was certainly a consistent pattern. So we also have this further Althoff systematic review that found strong evidence for the efficacy of parent-mediated intervention to increase child joint attention. And in their systematic review, they also identified that moderate improvements with communication were apparent. So we're aware that mediators can be thought of as part of what is making the change during intervention. So specific ingredients that are kind of known to mediate the outcomes, and these have been found within the field of PMI to be parental synchrony by the Pickles team and mirrored pacing. Okay, So whilst mediators are understood and outcomes to some extent are understood, much less is known about moderators. So moderators are what potentially interact with the change. So these interactions potentially influence the size of or the direction of change. So for example, they might contribute to increasing or decreasing in the amount of change in expected outcomes. And overall, much less is known about moderators of outcome than is known about the mediators. Sorry. Okay, so, and from clinical experience, we know that individuals respond quite variably to PMI, as I pointed out at the beginning. So currently, there is some understanding about which child factors might be influencing the success of intervention. There's kind of emerging work in this area. So, for example, Trembuth and colleagues have identified that autism characteristics, or we could say profiles, might be contributing, and adaptive functioning skills might be contributing to the change that gets observed over time. And I'm sure for those of you working clinically in this area, you might have some thoughts about what might be playing an influence there too. There's also some emerging evidence to suggest that parental factors that might be influencing the success of intervention are things like socioeconomic status and broad autism phenotype of the parent and or parent stress levels, although the picture is really quite unclear, and in that Charlotte paper you'll see that there's a sort of, it can be argued both ways, especially in terms of stress. Okay, so and one other thing that I think is really important to bear in mind here is the fact that protected characteristics are often missing from the autism research. I think things are improving. Wong identified this in 2015. Things are improving, but I do think that in order for us to address health inequalities, we must be better at reporting protected characteristics within our research. Okay, so just moving on. So following on from some of the gaps identified in the literature and some of the clinical experience that I've spoken about, the research question here for this study is, do child and or adult characteristics moderate parent-mediated intervention outcomes for preschool autistic children and children awaiting autism assessment? So, just before I talk about the actual current stage, we were able to do a feasibility stage before we finalised the current study. And during this, we were able to work with service users and clinicians on the team to decide what was working well and what was perhaps a little bit more problematic. So we explored the measures that we had selected, and we determined whether we thought that they were acceptable for parents and whether they were considered as usable. And as you can see, overall, there was measures were deemed acceptable, and parents welcomed the information that they received about their child in response to the information, because we basically wrote a research report for each of the families, and this was beneficial for families, so they reported that being an advantage. However, there were some areas of concern which led to us removing some of the assessments from the protocol on the basis that perhaps some were a little bit inaccessible, and we also built in a step, a specific signposting step for parents who might be benefiting from a little bit more emotional support. Okay, so this is thinking about the actual study design. So here you can see we start by measuring parent and child characteristics. So these are the moderators, the things that we feel that there's a lack of knowledge about currently. I'll talk to you about which ones we chose on the next slide. But this is the rest of the study design is that we basically at time point 1 did a baseline assessment. So we used Catherine Aldred and colleagues' dyadic communication measure for autism, the PLS-5, so the preschool language scales, and the social responsiveness scale, completed by parents and by nursery staff. Or somebody within the education setting. So these are a mix of observation tools, direct assessment, and parental or familiar adult report, which I think is beneficial to have that kind of range. And we also had some parent outcome measures that looked at quality of life and parent empowerment. So parent and child dyads received an evidence-informed 11-week parent-mediated intervention programme. So it was this programme here called SCIPS. It's delivered by SLTs and students. So SCIPS, so the Social Communication and Interaction Preschool Supports, has been designed at the University of Reading with my colleague and supervisor Tom, and draws on existing literature within the field. So SCIPS focuses on those known mediators, so the things that we know are contributing to the change, so parental synchrony and mirrored pacing, and then there's also a big focus on environmental arrangement and early communication skills. So parents so basically the parents will come to the sessions, they'll come for 11 weeks, they have some clinic sessions, but they're also expected to do some homework, 30 minutes a day. Outcome measures were then taken at both at the end of intervention and at 3-month post follow-up, 3-month follow-up. So I'll take you on to the next slide. You can see the different parent and child characteristics that were selected. So I said that I'd talk you through these are the things that we think are potential moderators of outcomes. So we wanted to measure characteristics that fitted with our understanding of what the literature was already telling us, our clinical experience, and we also used another phase of PhD work, which looked at whether parents and practitioners were asked to share their thoughts on what makes children more available for...
Sorry to interrupt, just 1 minute left.
Oh, is there only 1 minute left? Okay, right. Have I taken 14 minutes already? Goodness, yes. Sorry. Speed on through. So this is thinking about different areas, and we wanted to have communication, cognition, and sensory profiles considered. Okay, so as you can see from the next slide, the participants that we've got came from we've got a fairly diverse group. We've got a mix of gender. Lots of children were being raised in bi or multilingual environments. Some of the children were on waiting lists for assessment. As you can imagine, there's long waiting lists, and some of them did have co-occurring conditions. So let me just skip on to the data set processing bit that hopefully will give you a bit of an idea of where we are in the study. So 43 of the we had 43 children, and 43 of them completed baseline assessment, 42 out of 43 completed intervention and outcome assessment, and 40 completed then the follow-up assessment as well. So that's actually, we felt that was really positive in terms of retention. We found that in terms of outcome measures, the DCMA has been really usable. We've got a full data set there for our apart from one video that was corrupted, and we've been lucky to have some reliability, some blind coding done for those videos before shifting into reliability coding phase. We've got a full set of, we've got 30 out of 43 PLS5 datas and 70% of SRS. I'll skip over the parent outcomes because I'm mindful of time. Our intention is to do multiple moderation analysis, but I realise I can hear that I'm really out of time, aren't I?
Yes, you are, I'm afraid. I'm going to stop you there, and I'm sure people will love to see the slides, which I know people are asking to be shared, but there's never enough time, is there, for these talks, so thank you so much.
No, I think I must have waffled more than I intended, sorry.
It's all right. Hopefully, with a bit of luck and the fair wind behind us, I'm hoping to introduce Gino Hippolito to share his slides. Wonderful.
Right, can you see that?
We can, Gino. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Brilliant, excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gino Polotto. My presentation is on the systematic review and meta-analysis of non-pharmacological interventions for childhood selective mutism, the implications and applications for the SLT profession. I'm currently doing an NIHR doctoral clinical practitioner and academic fellowship, and my clinical host is St. George's, and my academic host is University of Oxford. The research was carried out during my NIHR predoctoral clinical academic fellowship under the supervision of Professor Cresswell. And I wanted to acknowledge not only NIHR, St. George's and University of Oxford, but also University of Reading, who was my academic host at the time with Dr. Pagnamenta as my mentor, and also University of Essex for Professor Joffe as my supervisor. A bit of background on the need for this systematic review. The research reviews in selective mutism in the last 30 years have mostly been narrative reviews. There have been very few systematic reviews that investigate the effectiveness of interventions. So those that did were narrow reviews looking specifically at medication or medication CBT, and there was also very few reviews as well using meta-analyses. So I'm finding it difficult to move things forward here. So just a few technical difficulties with moving the slide on. Oh, there we go.
Gino, I think we're both sharing screen at the same time. I think that's what's happened. So I'm going to, I think we both start screen sharing. So let me leave so you can control the slides.
Appreciate it. I wasn't sure what was happening there at the time. Actually, Darren, probably I'll minimize this if you can just. I'll stop.
You just yeah. If you want to say next slide, I can do them for you. Not a problem.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So sorry about that. So just in terms of there are a few systematic reviews. There are a few systematic reviews, and the ones that did have systematic review was more of a narrow review, which focused on medication. Other narrative reviews focused on, another systematic review focused on medication and CBT therapy. Next click, please. And then a few other reviews focus on meta-analyses. However, in this recent study, they combined all the outcomes together, and we do not know what the effect sizes for the specific outcomes were and whether the outcomes differed according to the treatment. But next click, please. Today's presentation will be comparing the results of Stone and colleagues' 2002 review due to its broad nature and its closest in comparison in terms of understanding general landscape of selective mutism interventions being researched. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. When it comes to our profession, SLTs have contributed greatly to the clinical practices and interventions of childhood selective mutism here in the UK and also Europe. And Maggie Johnson and Alison Wingen's contribution with the Selective Mutism Resource Manual is used by most clinicians here in the UK and also overseas. And we have national and regional selective mutism centres, which has gained interest from educational psychologists, specialist teachers and clinical psychologists. But the question is, are our interventions that we use evidence-based? Next slide, please. The systematic review was a broad review investigating what the outcome measures were using, what the outcome measures used in the intervention studies, and also what were the outcomes of the pre-experimental and experimental studies too. But for the first question, you can read the paper, which is in open access, the JCPP Advances Journal. But today I'll focus on the second question, which is which non-pharmacological interventions for children and adolescents are effective in increasing SM remission rates and improving speaking behaviors, and what do the interventions look like and how have they changed, and what are the current gaps and the implications and applications for our profession. Next slide, please. We followed the PRISMA guidelines, which are the guidelines for carrying out systematic review and meta-analyses, and we registered the review in Prospero as part of our best practice. And we searched 13 medical, education, and psychological databases and used hand searches for key SM papers and textbooks and forward searches on key papers so we can get the latest literature, both peer-reviewed and grey literature. In the end, we had 25 studies and included 5 studies in the meta-analyses. Next slide, please. We found that the study design had improved since Stone's. Stone's systematic review had few experimental study designs and no randomized controlled trials. But we found 6 RCTs and 5 single case experimental designs. We also found more manualized treatments. Stone had no manualized treatments and therefore prompted a recommendation for future research to improve in this area. We found 23 studies, which is 92%, had a protocol or manual for the intervention, which allows for replication for future research. But although the study designs had improved in our qualitative assessment, we found 68% of the studies were of low quality, high risk of bias. And unfortunately, only 3 studies were jointly carried out by speech and language therapists, and 3 studies involved speech and language therapists providing intervention. Next slide, please. We found there was a shift towards more combined systems and behavioral treatments. In Stone's review on the left, the most common intervention is behavioral only, which is about 48%, followed by combined treatments, which tended to be behavioral treatment and medication. And then psychodynamic treatments at 15%, systems, and then pharmacological interventions at 3%. Now, systems is formerly known as family systems therapy, tends to focus on modifying the communication and interaction patterns within the family and those around the child. So much like in the Selective Mutism Resource Manual, like creating the anxiety-free environment or creating the right environment. However, in our current systematic review, we did not include pharmacological interventions in our searches, but when we did do the searches, there was no psychodynamic studies found and no pure systems studies. And behavioral-only studies formed 24% of the studies, and while combined systems and behavioral approach was just under 3/4 at 72% in the dark purple. And so combined systems and behavioral is much like Johnson and Wingen's 24/7 model in the Selective Mutism Resource Manual. And then we had one study making up 4%, is the psychomotor study, which is similar to play therapy using combined systems, behavioral, and body-oriented approach. Next slide, please. Many slides did not describe the intervention components, so there's no definitive list either. So we started the conversation in the paper by listing and defining the intervention components in the studies. And this is what it looks like in the intervention studies in the systematic review. The most common components was exposure and reward, psychoeducation, and some sort of rapport building strategy. So that's adapting our communication style to suit the individual with SM. And the exposure component in the studies most often used was stimulus fading, also known as sliding in, shaping, graded exposure, and video self-modeling. Next slide, please. Regarding who delivered the intervention with the child, the most common combination involved the clinician, parent, and teacher. And 4 of these in the dark, highlighted in the dark blue, the clinician guided the parent and teacher without directly working with the child. And we found this quite interesting because a lot of speech therapists use this model, particularly when working with young children with selective mutism. Next slide, please. The interventions were delivered by various combinations of locations, and 16 interventions highlighted in the dark blue, which is 64%, used the school environment or in-person classroom simulation as part of the interventions, indicating the importance of intervention being carried out in situations where mutism occurs. Next slide, please. Regarding dosage, if you see in table 1, there's a wide range of dosage between the studies, and ranged between 2 hours to 54 hours across the duration of 5 days to over a year. Next slide, please. Now, looking at the participants, all the studies included 9 years and under, and few studies included teenagers. And there was also limited diversity in the samples. Few included bilingual children and those with speech and language needs, and few also included neurodiverse populations. And we know in the research that these populations are a high risk of selective mutism, so there are gaps in our understanding of the effectiveness of interventions for these populations. Next slide, please. And these two graphs are forest plots used to describe the effect sizes and the overall effect sizes in the studies. The one on the left is the first forest plot where it's treatments, 38 participants all in all, and waiting list controls, which is a total of 36. And in the highlighted in the blue, the overall size was a large size, which is 1.06 effect size, Hedges G. And it was also found to be statistically significant because if you see the diamond there, it doesn't cross that vertical line, which is the line of null effect. And we found that these three studies on the left were not only homogeneous in statistically, but also clinically as well. That all three studies used combined systems and behavioral approach, and all three studies used psychoeducation, rapport building, and exposure and reward. And all three studies use clinicians, parents, and teachers or simulated teacher working together. The forest plot on the right, we have treatment, 88 participants all together versus active controls, 99 participants all together in two studies. And highlighted in the red, the overall effect size is a medium effect size, which is 0.55. However, it was not found to be statistically significant because if you see the diamond, it crosses the vertical line of null effect. And so due to the studies being very different, not only statistically, but also very different clinically, but due to time, I cannot go into this, but if you have any questions in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer it. Next slide, please. Now, looking at remission rates, we only had data for these two RCTs, that's 26 in treatment and 24 in waiting lists. Control. The risk ratio is the likelihood of SM resolving when compared to having no treatment. And a risk ratio of 1, which is that vertical line, indicates that there would be no difference between treatment and control. But if we look at the highlights, oh, sorry, there's no highlighted blue there. There's 4.25 would indicate treatment 4 times more likely resolving SM than waiting list controls. But if you see the confidence interval, the diamond shape, it crosses the line of no effect, and therefore it's not considered to be significant. So we need to be cautious with this statistic, with this result. But I believe it's likely to be due to the small number of participants and also the small numbers of studies in the meta-analysis. Next slide, please. In conclusion, there are promising results for combined systems and behavioral intervention approaches using psychoeducation, rapport building, exposure, and reward. And Johnson and Wingen's 24/7 model uses these principles. But each service provision for childhood selective mutism across the UK need to consider whether their practices reflect the current evidence base. And secondly, the selective mutism population is known for its neurodiversity, its ethnocultural and linguistic diversity, yet the research population does not reflect that, indicating a significant gap in the literature. As a profession, we're used to working with neurodiverse, multicultural, and multilingual populations, and there are more and more speech and language therapists working in adolescents with SM. So by engaging in research, SLTs are in an opportune position to help fill the gap in the literature. And next slide, please. And just lastly, my current research in PhD is the PRISM study, which stands for the Preschool and Primary School Interventions for Selective Mutism. The overall aim is to co-design an online supported intervention program. Right now, we're recruiting for the National Survey of Paediatric Therapists and Local Authority and Health and Social Care Therapists. So if you're interested, you could email me, or in the group chat, I've got the link there for the actual survey. It only takes 5 to 15 minutes to complete. I've also sent it out on Twitter too, so you could find it there. But soon we'll be recruiting for our qualitative study, exploring the experiences of childhood selective mutism intervention in the UK from the perspective of the child with lived experience, the adult with lived experience, the parent, the teacher, and also the therapist too. And then the PRISM expert reference group and the research team will co-design an online support intervention program in 2024. And in the following year, carry out a feasibility study of the new intervention. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Gino, and a remarkably calm and well-paced presentation, almost bang on time. With all those technical challenges, I tip my hat to you. That was very good. We've got some lovely questions for our panel, which I'll try and get through in the last remaining 10 minutes. So this is a question for Jill and for Rosemary. There's a couple of questions about the survey. do you intend to repeat the survey? Because what crossed my mind is that a lot of my service users say, I don't want to do online training, and then they do it and they go, oh, this is really good, and we got a chance to talk to the parents, and actually I've changed my mind about it all now. So I wondered if you're going to repeat it. I think, Jill, can you... Jill, you're still on mute, I'm afraid.
Sorry, Rosie, you go ahead.
We don't have any plans at this point in time to repeat it, but I think we do want to, and well, we had commented on the fact that some parents said that they would prefer face-to-face training, so we want to investigate that a little bit further to see what the reasons are behind that. We haven't actually thought about repeating it again, but we certainly maybe should consider that.
And I think somebody else said also surveying the attitudes and preferences of SLTs to see if they matched up or not would also be a good idea. Because I think we talk a lot about telehealth training and so forth, but we don't really know the answers to a lot of them. So I was really pleased to hear your survey.
There was actually a previous piece of work that we did. It was more general than that, but it was around therapists' attitudes to online working and telehealth and providing virtual therapy. And we found a massive variability. There were some people who really embraced it and others who were terrified. And I think that's, I would imagine it's moved on a little bit because we've all become so used to online conferencing, but therapy is another step forward.
Excellent. And the digital library of apps, is that available outside of Northern Ireland?
Well, it doesn't exist yet. But when it does, watch this space. Early
Wonderful.
Stages.
Well, I'm sure we'll be able to promote that on social media when that becomes available. That's wonderful. Yes, let's see what the other questions were. Yes, so a question about adolescents in schools. So Gino, what should people be thinking about to support adolescents in the school setting with reference to the evidence base?
Good question. There are some studies out there, but they're just case studies at the moment. It is found that, well, first of all, actually, I'll signpost you to some amazing colleagues who are actually working with adolescents with SM. And so that's Susanna Thompson, also Libby Hill as well, and Anita McKiernan as well. So they're, if you wanted to get in contact with them, I'm sure they will be able to help you from that point of view. In terms of the research, there are some studies working with adolescents using apps, using shaping as well, and they found that sometimes using apps can be a way to take away the pressure and the social pressure and the interaction pressure as well, and rather than just using a sliding in approach. But I find that with working with adolescents, you're moving towards more of a social disability model, and also working with adults too. Will be following the same suit, and you'll be doing more kind of problem solving, more working on what kind of goals do they want to achieve, including them a lot more involved in the intervention. Does that answer that, or do you want me to probe a bit more?
I think because there's another question we'd like to ask Gino, I think what I would say to attendees is please do use the option to contact presenters directly and contact them about other questions if we don't have time to cover them in the session, which seems likely because we've lost some time to technical hitches, I'm afraid. There's another question from Susan McCann, which I think is quite interesting. Susan says, I'm aware that there seems to be a high correlation of children presenting with both selective mutism and significant restricted eaters, ARFID type behaviours. I'm wondering if these children might be high-level maskers of ASD and whether they're currently missed in the diagnostic process.
Quite possibly, and that's the challenge when it comes to dual diagnosis, and not many services are able to are specializing in that. And sometimes there might be overdiagnosis of autism, and sometimes even missing out autism because of the selective mutism. But yes, no, we do find that children and adolescents with selective mutism may have some difficulty with eating as well, particularly in public, and it has very much crossover with social anxiety and that idea of fear of being judged, or there could be all sorts of other things too. The main thing when it comes to working with these children and young people is just to consider to problem solve the situation, because it could be a sensory thing. If say the hall or the food hall is noisy, then that could be one of the triggers. So just consider the sensory issues, consider maybe the and also consider maybe the communication side of things, but there's often an overlap with SM and eating difficulties in public.
Yeah, I mean, I was also struck, one of my other interests is bilingualism, and it seems astonishing that there's so little evidence base around bilingual children as well.
That's true. There's only a few papers. There's Toppelberg when it comes to bilingualism, and just a few other sporadic. There's actually an interesting one by Anya Stark, if you want to know more about that, and some of that came out in 2018, and they followed preschool children in Germany with monolingual and bilingual, and they found some certain risk factors if they were bilingual and had behavioral inhibition, and increased the risk factor. And then if they had behavioral inhibition, bilingualism, and then if the parents didn't engage in the mainstream culture, that also increased the likelihood of developing selective mutism too.
Which is interesting, because the less likely people are to engage in the mainstream culture, the more likely they are to retain home language. So there's some tensions there between risk factors. Interesting. Elizabeth Pole has asked, given time constraints for second talk, are there takeaways for us relating to PMI in clinical work?
Well, very much PMI has been something that we've been doing for a few years now, and not just as part of this research study, but something that we've adopted within our teaching clinic. And certainly I think what we've felt along the way is it's been really nice to be able to take the relevant aspects from different research teams that have come up with what we know mediates intervention, and translating it into a usable format has been possible. So I think sometimes we look at research papers and we think that they're that looks all good on paper, but it might be quite complicated to roll out. But we've been fortunate to be able to condense it into a format that works for our service and for the clients that come through. So I don't know if that quite answers it, but hopefully.
Yeah, super, Sarah. So did you want to say anything more about your conclusions? Because we have just got a minute, because I felt that we missed some important conclusions from your presentation.
No, I'm sorry that I'm not sure quite why I wasn't keeping enough time on,
That's okay.
an eye on the time, but I obviously wasn't. Well, just that I think just that the knowledge about the moderators, I think we're hoping would be able to provide a little bit more personalised support in the long run. So I appreciate that we're not going to be in a position to know that fully, but we feel that that's kind of the goal of the work, really. And in turn, that could obviously improve outcomes, we would hope.
Absolutely, super. So wonderful. I'm not going to take any more questions now, because I think it's been a really interesting session. I think that people have really discussed the issues here. There's an awful lot to unpack in all of the presentations, isn't there? So as I say, please do contact the presenters to further your conversations outside of the session, just as you would in a real conference, and make those connections. I would like to reiterate my huge thanks to all the presenters for really kind of bearing with the technical issues that occurred. We got there in the end, which is the main thing. And to remind everybody that the presentation will be available usually about an hour after this session, this day is finished, and for 60 days after the conference has concluded. So you will be able to look back at the presentations and clarify anything. And if presenters are agreeable, we should be uploading and sharing the slides from the presentation. So things like pursuing the references will also be possible. So please, if you've got any further questions, do contact the presenters. Thank you so much, everyone who's attended. It's been such a well-attended session. I'm sure everyone's got lots out of it. Best of luck with your clinical and research futures. These are such interesting areas. It's been a delight to have you this afternoon, and I hope to see you at the closing keynote after